Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Kerberos webinar. We'll give it a couple more minutes for more people to join us, and then we'll get started. All right, so let's get started. So hi again. Welcome to our Kerberos webinar. My name is Elad Shamir, and I'm a service architect here at Spectrops, working primarily on the adversary simulation side. Today, we will dive into my favorite authentication protocol, and that is, of course, Kerberos. In general, I love studying authentication protocols and figuring out ways to abuse them. But at least to me, Kerberos is more interesting than any other authentication protocol because it has so many moving parts and such a big attack surface. I'll try to cover a lot in the next hour. We'll start with the Kerberos authentication process and learn how it works. That should take about 15 minutes. And then we'll continue to the second part of the webinar with Kerberos abuse, covering attacks such as overpass the hash and pass the key, golden, silver, and diamond ticket attacks, Kerberoasting and AS rep roasting. And we'll finish with SID hopping to escalate privileges from domain compromise to forest compromise. What you'll see today are selected slides from our Adversary Tactics Red Team Operations class. However, this is just a taste, just a high-level overview of these Kerberos-related concepts. In our RTO training, we dedicate about a day and a half to Kerberos and to Active Directory. We delve into the tooling, tradecraft options, OPSEC considerations, detection and evasion, but we can't cover all that in just an hour. There are also some related topics that we are not going to touch at all, and they are PK init, that is anything to do with public key authentication, such as certificate abuse and the shadow credentials attack. Kerberos delegation, even though it is by far my favorite subject. We can maybe dedicate a session to that some other time. Attack path analysis and Bloodhound, and in general, AD enumeration. When I learn technical concepts, I try to understand not only how things work, but also why do they work that way. The why is not always documented, or at least not always publicly available. So we often need to try to get into the heads of the people that designed whatever it is that we're discussing and try to understand the rationale behind their decisions. So let's do that with Kerberos. I think everybody agrees that it's one of the more complicated and confusing authentication protocols out there. And why is that? So I can think of a couple of considerations that probably led to it. One is that we want to avoid exposing credential material to services that don't already have it. So if we authenticate to a domain controller, it should be okay to send credential material because the domain controller supposedly already has it. But if we authenticate to a member server, such as a file server, we should avoid that. That means that we don't want to send clear text passwords or hashes, and we don't want to send anything derived from the passwords or the hashes if it can be used to crack them. A great example of that is an NTLM challenge response. And people have been capturing and cracking those to recover passwords for many years now, using tools like Responder. In general, I would say that this is one of the weaknesses in challenge response protocols. Another consideration is that we want to minimize exposure to network attacks. So we don't want to send credential material in the clear and expose it to interception through man-in-the-middle attacks. We want to prevent replay attacks. That means that if attackers capture our authentication packets, they shouldn't be able to replay them and successfully establish a session. And we want to prevent relay attacks, such as NTLM relay, and that is done in part by exchanging session keys to support signing later on. So let's see how Kerberos works. And before I do, I just want to say that even though there are plenty of attacks against this protocol, and maybe in hindsight, some things could have been done better, I really do think that it's a brilliant protocol. And I think, well, I have a lot of appreciation both to the people that designed it and to the protocol itself. All right, so let's get started. So it starts when the user logs in. When you log on to a domain joined Windows host, the local security authority, or LSA, creates a new logon session for you, generates encryption keys from your password, and stores them in LSAS. Then LSA selects the strongest supported encryption type. On modern systems, it would be AES 256, and sends an AES-REC message to the KDC, which is the domain controller in AD environments. The AES-REC, well, AES-REC stands for Authentication Service Request. That request contains a timestamp of the current time encrypted with the encryption key that was derived from the user's password for pre-authentication. Pre-authentication is meant to prove to the DC that the client has the credentials for the account, and the timestamp helps prevent replay attacks. The DC validates the AES-REC, and if it all checks out, it generates a ticket granting ticket, or TGT for short. The TGT contains information about the validity of the ticket, when it was created, or to be more precise, from when will it be valid, when it will expire. It contains the user's username, and Microsoft extended Kerberos tickets to contain more information in a PAC, Privilege Attribute Certificate. That PAC contains the user's security identifier, group memberships, and other information that can help services make authorization decisions later on. The ticket also contains a random session key that the DC generates. The DC encrypts the ticket with a key generated from the password of the KRB TGT account. Every domain has that account, and the key generated from the password of this account protects all the TGTs in the domain. And for that reason, it is often referred to as the keys to the kingdom, as it allows forging golden tickets. And we will, of course, get to that a bit later in the second part of this webinar. The TGT is sent back to the client in an AES-REP message, that is a response. Along with that TGT, the AES-REP message contains a copy of the TGT's session key, encrypted with the user's encryption key. That is that key that was generated from the user's password. That allows the user to access the session key. We will see in a moment that the session key is required for actually using the TGT. And because the session key is encrypted, man-in-the-middle attackers can't use or abuse an intercepted TGT. Now the user wants to access a file server. To do that, the user must first obtain a service ticket by sending a TGS rec to the DC. TGS stands for Ticket Granting Service. This service allows exchanging a TGT for a service ticket. So the TGS rec message obviously contains the user's TGT, and it also contains an authenticator. An authenticator is always required when using a Kerberos ticket. The client generates that authenticator by putting together information such as the user's password, a sequence number, and a timestamp, and encrypting all that with the TGT's session key. That proves to the DC that the client has the session key and that the request is genuine. An attacker that obtains a TGT but not the session key cannot generate a valid authenticator, so that's an effective mitigation against man-in-the-middle attacks. The TGS rec also specifies the service name of the service for which the user wants a ticket. In this example, it is cifs/fs.contoso.local. Cifs represents the service class or the service type, and fs.contoso.local is the host name. Together, they make a service principal name. The DC decrypts the TGT and the authenticator and validates them. If everything checks out, the DC locates the AD account associated with the service principal name in the TGS rec. The service name in the TGS rec needs to match the service principal name attribute of one AD account, and that will be the target service account. In our example, it is cifs/fs.contoso.local, and the associated service account would be the computer account of that file server. So the account name is likely $, because that is the naming convention for computer accounts. The DC then creates a service ticket for the user. The user information in the service ticket is copied from the TGT rather than collected from AD. And that's an important thing to note that will come into play when we discuss ticket forgery. The DC generates a new session key for this service ticket and encrypts the new service ticket with a key generated from the service account's password. The service ticket is sent back to the client in a TGS rep message along with a session key encrypted with the TGT's session key. It is similar to how the session key for a TGT is sent back encrypted with the user's password or with a key generated from the user's password. It helps prevent man-in-the-middle attackers from abusing service tickets that they intercept over the wire. Now the user can finally authenticate to the file server by sending in an app rec message. The app rec message is typically encapsulated in another application layer protocol. It would be SMB in this case. The app rec contains the user's service ticket and an authenticator encrypted with the service ticket session key, similar to the authenticator in the TGS rec. So again, an attacker that obtains a service ticket, but not the corresponding session key, cannot abuse it. A Kerberos ticket without the associated session key is useless. We finally got to the last step in which the file server can authenticate the user. The service ticket is encrypted with the server's password, so the server can decrypt it. The server can also decrypt the authenticator because it's encrypted with a session key that it can extract from the decrypted service ticket. So the server can validate the ticket and the authenticator and that part covers authentication. The server can then make an authorization decision whether the user is permitted to access the file share or not, based on the information in the ticket. One nice thing to note here is that the server can authenticate the user and make an authorization decision without contacting the DC. It's all done based on the information in the ticket. Another thing to note is that no credential material is sent to the server. Not a challenge response, not a password, not a hash. And all the encryption keys at this point are either random or already known to the file server. I think that it's a pretty clever way to authenticate users and to authorize access. The last step is for the server to respond with an app rep message to tell the user that it's all good and potentially exchange a new session key if that's required. We have here an overview of the entire process for your reference. If you don't remember it by heart yet, don't worry. We'll see it a few more times in this session. And we will also explain the steps very briefly again as we go over the abuse techniques for each step. I want to make a couple of observations about the Kerberos authentication process. One, some encryption keys are generated from passwords, which could be a problem if the passwords aren't sufficiently strong. Two, if a key is compromised, the entire authentication flow can be compromised, and we will, of course, show you how. And that brings us to the second part of this webinar, and that is, of course, Kerberos abuse. Kerberos abuse has been evolving for the past, I want to say 20 years, and we now have at least one attack against pretty much every step in the process. So let's start from the beginning. The first attack is overpass the hash, a term coined by Benjamin Delpy, the creator of Mimikatz. The idea here is that if you have the Kerberos encryption key for a user, but not the password, then you can skip the password generation step and just inject the keys into LSAS. But where would you get the keys to begin with? You can extract them from LSAS using Mimikatz with the secure SAM module. It will scrape LSAS's memory and extract all the Kerberos keys it can find in there. You can also dump keys from a domain controller with DCSync. In this attack, you already have high privileges in the domain, and you replicate data from a domain controller, just like other domain controllers do, in order to extract keys directly from Active Directory. And of course, if you can generate the keys from the password, if you happen to have it. We have here examples for these approaches. DCSync on the left. On the top right, we see dumping keys from LSAS with Mimikatz. And on the bottom right, we see generating the keys from the password with Rubius. Note that the RC4 key is in fact the NT hash, which means that there is no salt in there. If two users have the same password, they will have the same NT hash and the same RC4 Kerberos encryption key. It is not the case with AES. The AES keys are salted with both the domain name and the username. To execute the overpass the hash attack, you'll need to use Mimikatz. The pass the hash module covers overpass the hash as well. It creates a new suspended process in a sacrificial logon session with some bogus password. This logon session is a network-only logon, which means that the password is not used or even validated until the process tries to access a remote resource and needs to authenticate. Then Mimikatz obtains a read-write handle on LSAS's memory and overwrites the keys in that logon session with the keys provided to Mimikatz. It then resumes the process. And if that process attempts to perform any Kerberos authentication, it will use the new keys that are now injected into the logon session in LSASS. That's obviously not the best OPSEC because we're getting a read-write handle to LSASS, and any EDR will most probably or most certainly detect that. As a rule, on red teams, we should avoid touching LSASS if we want to avoid detection. So instead, we can perform a similar attack called pass the key. In this attack, we use a tool like Kikio or Rubius to craft the Kerberos messages and send them directly to the DC without going through LSASS at all. We'll see how we can actually use the ticket that we obtained through this technique a bit later when we get to the pass the ticket attack. We can see here how Rubius sends an ASREC and obtains a TGT for the user. That base64 encoded blob that we see here is often mistaken for a ticket. It is partially correct. It does contain a ticket, but it's more than just a ticket. It's in fact a Kerb-cred element that contains not only the ticket, but also a credential information element that contains the session key and other information. Now remember that without the session key, the ticket is useless. The next step in the process is the ASREC message. This message contains a timestamp encrypted with a key generated from the user's password for pre-authentication. So if you intercept it, you can try to crack the password offline. And if the password isn't sufficiently strong, you'll be able to compromise the account. However, on red team operations, you wouldn't typically run man-in-the-middle attacks because they tend to be loud and potentially even disruptive. Another way to abuse ASRECs is through password spraying. It's a relatively fast way to run online password attacks. And by default, domain controllers don't log failed pre-authentication attempts. So it could fly under the radar in some cases, but I wouldn't count on it. Nowadays, I'd say that most organizations change those defaults and collect those failed pre-authentication events. In general, you should avoid password spraying on red teams. There are better ways to get passwords. You can run this attack with Rubius if you like, but again, this is not appropriate for a red team if you want to avoid detection, but it is something that you can consider on a pen test. Next is ASREP. The ASREP contains a session key encrypted with a key generated from the user's password. If you intercept it, you can try to crack it offline, just like the ASREC. But more interestingly, some accounts actually do not require pre-authentication, which allows anyone to get a valid ASREP even without knowing the password for the account. It's not commonly configured that way, but we do sometimes see it in legacy systems or for Linux interoperability. I would say that nowadays, there isn't really a good excuse for this misconfiguration. In any case, if an account is configured this way, it is vulnerable to ASREP roasting. ASREP roasting is similar to Kerberoasting, but slightly different. We'll get to Kerberoasting in a couple of minutes. When an account doesn't require pre-authentication, we can send an ASREC without knowing the password and get a valid ASREP, a valid response. The ASREP has some material encrypted with the user's password, so we can try to crack it. And if the password is not strong, we can potentially compromise the account. You can find accounts with that misconfiguration using tools like power view or sharp view or standing or any tool really that allows you to run an LDAP query with this LDAP filter. You can run the attack with Rubius or InPacket and get AS reps for cracking. And you can use Hashcat or John the Ripper to try to crack them. Next, TGS rec. In the TGS rec, we exchange a TGT for a service ticket to a specific service. A TGT alone without the session key is useless. And the session keys are long and random, so cracking them is not feasible. So man-in-the-middle attacks won't do us any good at this point. However, the TGT is encrypted with the KRB TGT account's password. So if we can somehow put our hands on that password or on the encryption keys generated from that password, we can forge our own TGTs and skip all the previous steps. And that is the infamous golden ticket attack. Also, another thing that we can do, if we can get our hands on a legitimate TGT somehow, we can pass the ticket to use this ticket and skip all the previous steps in the authentication flow. So golden tickets. Golden tickets are forged TGTs. Because TGTs are encrypted and signed with the KRB TGT account keys, if we get those keys, we can make our own tickets. When we make our own ticket, we can also enter whatever information we like into the ticket, whichever username or user SID that we like. We can claim we're members in privileged groups, even if we're not, and so on. Now remember that when the DC generates a service ticket, it doesn't pull the user's information from AD. It just copies it from the TGT. So whatever information we put in our golden ticket will ultimately propagate to service tickets that we obtain with this golden ticket. Also, we can forge the tickets offline without running tools in the target environment if that's a concern, and it can be a concern if we're worried about EDRs detecting our activity. When forging tickets, there are two general strategies. The quick and dirty strategy, implemented in Mimikatz and in InPacket, and the realistic strategy implemented in Rubius. The quick and dirty approach forges a minimalistic ticket with just the mandatory fields, claims group memberships in all the privileged groups like domain admins, and slaps a 10-year lifetime on the ticket rather than the normal 10 days, which is the default. This might have been good enough when ticket forgery was a new thing and Kerberos tickets didn't get much scrutiny. But nowadays, that's just asking for trouble. The realistic approach, on the other hand, implemented in Rubius, tries to forge a ticket that is as close as possible to a real ticket. The Rubius implementation can even pull all the required information from the DC to help you get everything right. So following the realistic approach, Charlie Clark and Andrew Schwartz took it to the next level with diamond tickets. Why forge a ticket from scratch and potentially make mistakes if you can modify a real ticket generated by a domain controller? And that's what diamond tickets are, modified TGTs. In the diamond ticket attack, we first obtain a real ticket using valid credentials, then decrypt it and modify it to fit our needs. For example, add membership in the domain admins group. We then re-encrypt it and use it. This way, the ticket is as close as it gets to a legitimate ticket. And there are also security events showing that the ticket was legitimately requested from a DC which can help evade certain detection that track that sort of activity. So you have a Kerberos ticket in your hands. Maybe you forged it, maybe you dumped it from a host. What do you do with it? You obviously need to use it before it expires. By default, that's 10 hours from when it was created, and it can be renewed for up to 7 days. That's a long time. What you need to do is import it into your logon session if you're on a Windows host. Microsoft was very kind and implemented a function that allows users to do just that, import a Kerberos ticket into a logon session. And if you import it into your own logon session, you don't even have to be elevated. You can do that in an unelevated context. Doing that is called pass the ticket, and it is implemented in both Mimikatz and Rubius and in other tools like Cobalt Strike's Beacon. It is simply an API call that ultimately sends an RPC message to LSAS. That's how it works under the hood. And I'll emphasize here that what we're actually passing in the pass the ticket attack is actually not just the ticket. It is that curb cred element that contains both the ticket and the information required for using it, including the session key. All right, can you crack the cipher? I'll leave those tickets side by side here for a few seconds to give you a chance to do that while I take a sip of water. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Time is up. I'm sure some of you managed to figure out that it is a Caesar cipher or a shift cipher, and the key is 2. You can see that this 1 turned into a 3, and this 2 turned into a 4, and the J turned into an L, and so on. What you did there when you cracked the keys of a service ticket is technically Kerberoasting. Kerberoasting is probably the most famous Kerberos attack, maybe in close competition with golden tickets. It was introduced by Tim Edin back in 2014, and the world has never been the same again. How does it work? A TGS rep contains a service ticket, and a service ticket is encrypted with a key generated from the service account's password. So we have something to work with. And by work with, I mean take that ticket and try to crack it offline. And you should know the routine by now. If the password is not sufficiently strong, you can potentially crack it and compromise the account. And remember that anyone can obtain a service ticket, regardless of whether they are actually permitted to access the service or not. So the exposure is quite big. Most service accounts are, in fact, computer accounts or managed service accounts, meaning that their passwords are long and random and not really crackable. But there are almost always some normal user accounts with service principal names assigned to them, making them act as service accounts, while their passwords are potentially set by mere mortals. So potentially not as strong. When obtaining a service ticket, you would want to negotiate RC4 encryption to make cracking more feasible. You used to be able to negotiate RC4 for any service account if RC4 was enabled. But as of Windows Server 2019, you'll get the strongest encryption supported by the service account, which is beyond your control. The client has no part in that negotiation anymore, which makes sense because the client doesn't need to decrypt the ticket. However, user accounts, which is what we want to target anyway, support only RC4 encryption for service tickets by default. So there's still a good chance of success. So what are the steps? First, we need to find user accounts that have SPNs assigned to them. These are our potential targets. If you look at the LDAP filter here, you'll see that this is exactly what we're looking for. The account type needs to be a user account, and the service principal name attribute needs to have a value. Anything that's not blank is good enough for us. Next, we send TGS recs to obtain service tickets and extract the encrypted part from the tickets in the TGS reps. Now we can try to crack the passwords, and if we're lucky, we get a password, and then we can obviously access whatever the service account can access. And we too often find Kerberoastable accounts that are privileged accounts, such as members of the domain administrators group, or even the built-in administrator account is often Kerberoastable. But there's another thing that we can do, and most people fail to connect to Kerberoasting, and that is forging a silver ticket. More on that in a moment. Now, let's get back to the authentication flow. The next step is app rec. This is where we send a service ticket to the target service. Just like with TGS recs and golden tickets, if we have the encryption key, we can forge our own service ticket, and that is the silver ticket attack. If we have the key and we make our own service ticket, we can skip all the previous steps in the process. And pass the ticket applies to this step as well. If we somehow put our hands on a service ticket, we can just import it into our logon session and use it. So silver tickets are forged service ticket, just like golden tickets are forged TGTs. If we get the keys, that is the service account's password, which is often the computer account, then we can make our own service tickets. The nice thing is that by default, no traffic flows from the service or from the member server to the DC. So there are fewer logs that can potentially detect us. Keep in mind that if you forge a silver ticket for a computer account, it can last for only up to 30 days because computers automatically change the password of their computer account every 30 days, at least by default. And when the password changes, the encryption key changes too. And then the ticket is no longer valid because the key is generated from the password. Now let's connect that back to Kerberoasting. If you compromise a service account via Kerberoasting, you can then forge a silver ticket and impersonate whoever you like to that target service. The classic example is a SQL server, and I believe that's also the example that Tim Edin presented back in DerbyCon in 2014 when he first introduced Kerberoasting. If you successfully Kerberoast the account of a SQL server, you can impersonate a privileged account using a silver ticket, execute commands on the SQL server, and compromise not only the database, but also the host. And I think SQL servers running with Kerberoastable accounts, or even privileged Kerberoastable accounts, is by far the most common Kerberoasting scenario out there that we actually see in the field. All right, now let's see how Kerberos authentication works across trusts. When trust is established between domains, and it doesn't matter whether it's interforest or intraforest, whether it's a parent-child relationship or the roots of two different forests, an inter-realm trust key is exchanged between the domains. That key allows sending referrals from one domain to the other, and it essentially links up those two environments for authentication purposes. In this scenario, we have a bidirectional trust between two forests Contoso, and Fabricam. And we have a user, John, from Contoso, trying to access a file server in Fabricam. So first, John needs to get a TGT. So he sends an ASREC to the DC in his own domain. It always starts with the user's own domain. The DC pulls John's information from AD and creates a TGT. Now pay attention to the extra seeds field in the ticket. When a user is a member of a group in another domain, it is listed in the extra seeds field. SID history is also listed in the extra seeds field. We'll explain what it is and discuss it in detail a bit later. Moving on, the DC encrypts the TGT with the Kerberos TGT key and then returns it to the user in an AS rep. Now the user wants to get a service ticket, so he sends a TGS rec to a DC in his own domain. Again, it always starts with the user's own domain. The TGS rec contains the user's TGT and an authenticator encrypted with the session key. The DC decrypts and validates the TGT and the authenticator. And at this point, if everything checks out, as far as the DC is concerned, the user is authenticated. If the DC could issue a service ticket to fs.fabricam.local, it would, but it doesn't have the encryption key for that service account because it is in a different domain. So instead, the DC creates a referral TGT for the user to the Fabricam domain by copying the information from the TGT to the new ticket. And the referral TGT is encrypted using the inter-realm trust key that the domains exchanged earlier. The referral TGT is returned to the user in a TGS rep. And now the user can send a TGS rec to the DC in the Fabricam domain. The DC decrypts the ticket using the inter-realm trust key and validates it. Now the DC can issue a service ticket for John to the file server. To do that, the DC copies the information from the referral TGT to a new service ticket. However, there is some seed filtering going on here. And you can see that the extra seeds field in the new ticket is blank. We won't get into the seed filtering rules in this short session. We'll just mention that it is a security mechanism that removes extra seeds that shouldn't be there, hint, hint. And by default, it is applied only across forest trusts, but not within a forest. Again, hint, hint. In this scenario, we have two different forests, so it kicked in and filtered something out. Next, the DC encrypts the service ticket with the file server's password and sends it back to the user. And now the user can finally send the ticket to the file server and authenticate to it. The file server can decrypt the ticket to authenticate the user and make an authorization decision based on information in the ticket. This is an overview of the entire process across forest trusts. For your reference, you may notice that there are two iterations of the TGS rec, TGS rep in this diagram. In complex environments with multiple trusts, that step can repeat several times until the user traverses the necessary trusts and get a referral to the domain of the target service account. Okay, so we added steps. Let's see how we can abuse them. Which brings us to the Trustpocalypse. The Trustpocalypse abuses a mechanism called SID history, which I mentioned earlier. SID history was introduced to allow the migration of accounts from one domain to another by adding the user's old SID to the SID history attribute of the user's account. because when users migrate to another domain, they get new seeds. A user's seed is made of the domain seed, which is unique for every domain, and the user's read relative ID. When the user is migrated to another domain, the domain seed will definitely change, and the read will almost certainly change too. So there's going to be a new seed for the user. There's no escaping that. And seeds are what's used in security descriptors when you grant users access to objects or resources. And it is what's used when you add users to groups. So SID history is a mechanism that helps users keep their access even though their SID changed. How does it work? When users try to access services or resources, their access is evaluated not only based on their current SID, but also based on all the SIDs in their SID history. And we can abuse that. Let's say we compromise a child domain in a forest. We can add the SID of the enterprise admins group to the SID history of an account. And then that account will be treated as a member of the enterprise admins group, even without being added to the group. It is sort of a privilege escalation from domain admin to enterprise admin. As a domain admin in a child domain in a forest, you may not be able to add members to the enterprise admins group, but you will certainly be able to add SID history to users in your child domain. Now, let's take that to the next level. As I mentioned, SID history is added to the extra SIDs field of the Kerberos ticket. That's how it works under the hood. So instead of changing a user account SID history attribute, we can do something a bit more sneaky. We can forge a golden ticket and add the SID of the enterprise admins group to the extra SIDs field of the ticket. That would allow us to escalate privileges from DA to EA without making any changes to any AD account. So that's arguably cleaner. And that is one reason why the domain is not a security boundary in a forest. If you compromise a domain, you can compromise the entire forest. This is not the only way to do that in a forest, but that's the most famous way to do that. If you try to do that across forest trusts, SID filtering will kick in and it will not work, at least not by default. And that makes the forest a security boundary, unlike the domain. Technically, though, I'll mention that SID filtering can be disabled across forest trusts, and conversely, domains can be quarantined within a forest, which would enable SID filtering on that trust. So you shouldn't make any assumptions either way. If you want to forge a golden ticket with extra SIDs, Rubius, Mimikatz, and Impacket all support that with the SIDs argument. Just make sure you use the correct SID for the extra SIDs. If you want to escalate from DA to EA, it needs to be the SID of the root of the forest. And I see people getting that wrong very often and then wondering why it doesn't work. Keep in mind that that if you compromise the inter-realm trust key, you can also forge a referral TGT and skip another couple of steps in this flow. One last thing that I'll note here before wrapping up and answering questions is that you can also Kerberoast across trusts. It was the thing that gave me the breakthrough I needed on ops several times in the past. So I highly recommend looking out for that too, if that's what's standing in your way. I hope you enjoyed this very fast and very dense presentation. I tried to cover as much as possible in the short time that we had. If you want a lot more of that, we have a public offering of our RTO class coming up in a couple of weeks. And I believe there might be a few seats left. We also have a few seats left in our detection and our tradecraft analysis classes. As a former student in all those classes, I highly recommend them. You'll definitely learn a lot, and they're a lot of fun. So thanks again for joining us, and I will now look at the questions and see if I can answer them. All right, how much pack signature validation will enhance the Kerberos authentication process in July? So that's helps primarily with account mapping, if I remember correctly. So it will block a whole class of attacks that are in practice already blocked in many cases, because in most environments there's already enforcement if it's present. So it will help in harden some environments that are, I would say, misconfigured at this point or have some legacy DCs running there. Can the authenticator information be changed, or what is the minimum items required that the authenticator contains? The authenticator information cannot be changed if you don't have the session key, unless you're really good at cryptanalysis and you figure out some way to attack whatever encryption algorithm is used there. If it's RC4 or AES, it's not very likely. Can we get the slides? I believe we're going to share the slides after this session, and there will also be a recording available. What else we got here? Does the RC4 key end up being the NTLM hash that is cracked after Kerberoasting? Yes, that is exactly it. When you Kerberoast, if you recover the password, that's technically what you're going to get. Then you can generate both the RC4 and the NTLM hash, which are the same. When you run Kerberoasting, you're not really cracking the key directly. The key space is quite big. What you use is you run sort of a dictionary attack or a password attack. You first translate your key, your password list into keys, and then you see if you've successfully managed to crack the ticket. Is the RC4 key different than the session key? Yes, the RC4 key is sometimes referred to in the literature as the long-term key, and the session key is, of course, short-term. What else we got here? Does cracking ASREP from a service without authentication yield the victim's password? So in ASREP roasting, you target pretty much any account. It will typically be a user account, whereas in Kerberoasting, you target a service account. If you manage to get the key for a certain service account and you intercept any app recs, so any tickets sent by users to that service, you will not get the user's password. That's one of the nice things about Kerberoasting, about Kerberos in general, about the authentication protocol. Are these attack vectors related to the delegation configuration of service accounts? No. One of the things we did not cover in this session is Kerberos delegation. We didn't touch that at all. We can potentially do a session about Kerberos delegation some other time. Again, as a question about S3 to self, S3 to proxy, we did not touch those. These are Kerberos delegation extensions to the Kerberos protocol. It was not covered in this session. What else have we got here? How can a blue team defend against a diamond ticket attack? That's a really, really good question. I'll defer that to, I know that Charlie and Andrew that came up with the downward ticket attack have some blog posts and talks about that coming up soon. So I'll say stay tuned to that, and they'll produce some really cool content around that soon. Shadow credentials, as I mentioned, so there's a question here, can we talk about shadow credentials? That falls into the PK init category, along with credential abuse, with certificate abuse. We are not covering that in this session. There's a question here for RBCD attacks against a domain user without an SPN. Is there any other significant attacks that can be performed without breaking the user account? We did not really get into RBCD because that again relates to delegation, but I'll refer you to a very cool post by James Forshaw from, I think, a couple of years ago now, where he comes up with a very clever way to perform an RBCD attack without an SPN. What else have we got here? Often IR remediation for a compromised AD is rolled the Kerberos TGT password twice. Can you explain why that might not be enough? What other things would you need to consider? Obviously, the interim key too. Okay, so in an IR situation, if the Kerberos TGT account was compromised, you should assume that pretty much every key was compromised. That is the domain controller's keys, the interim trust keys. A lot of keys were compromised, and you need to rotate all of them and not just the Kerberos TGT keys. In addition to that, you need to figure out how the attackers compromised AD to begin with. It shouldn't be possible, right? There was some privilege escalation path that they used. There might be other paths that were available and did not abuse, so we want to close those as well. And of course, you need to worry about persistence. So did they change anything on in Active Directory or on the domain controllers or on any other host used by privileged users to gain access to privileged systems? If they installed backdoors in any of those, they'll have a way to regain access. So it's a very, very sticky situation once AD is compromised. So try to prevent that, because it's going to be a lot of pain if you get to that point. Can you do a golden ticket attack if selective auth is on? Well, it depends. It depends on the configuration. What is best practice to prevent Kerberos attacks? So there's a lot of different attacks that we covered here. I'll say that if you want to boil it down to the root cause of all evil when it comes to Kerberos, there were two observations that I mentioned at the beginning of the session. One, some keys are generated from passwords. If the passwords are not sufficiently strong, then we have a problem. So make sure you use strong passwords wherever you can. Move on to passwordless authentication. That's gonna save you a lot of pain. And two, if a key is compromised, then the entire process is compromised, right? That was the second observation. So you need to make sure that keys are not compromised. There are different ways for keys to get compromised. We covered some of them here. So you need to address that. And if you make sure that your keys stay safe and that all the passwords or all the keys are generated from strong enough passwords, that will mitigate a lot of what we covered today. I'm conscious of time. We're at the top of the hour, so I'll wrap up here. Thanks everyone again for joining me today. I hope it was interesting and you learned a lot. And again, if you want more of that, we have an RTO class starting in a couple of weeks, and you're more than welcome to join us. Have a good day, everyone.